Now, getting into the start of this, we want to look at a specific question. You can imagine as a SEAL operating in combat zones that I must have had some really impressive environments that have caused some massive fear in my life. And I love to ask this question around, what do you think my greatest fear was? And I've gotten answers, all sorts of different answers. From one of the first ones is losing my life. And actually that was a thing that I gave up pretty early on within my SEAL career, because I knew signing up for it that the likelihood of being injured or killed was very real. And especially when you get into combat, it's something that you have to really face early on. That one was pretty easy to get past. Another one might have been losing one of my men. And for sure, that was a worry, but more than anything, being able to drive me to be the best leader that I could be. The key answer to this is probably going to surprise you. One of my greatest fears was my wife, and actually when we met. So she picked me up in a bar in DC. I was out training with some agencies to further some special skill sets as a SEAL, and she picked me up in a bar, and this beautiful woman walked in, gave me a huge smile, and I was so terrified I ran up to the bathroom to try and work up the courage to talk to her, which I never did. Now think about that. Think of how crazy that is, that a SEAL that's been in combat, faced with some horrible situations, is actually terrified of a beautiful woman. And the reason I bring this up is a very, very key point. Fear is not relative, right? So what I'm scared of is not necessarily able to be assessed off of what you think I should be scared of or what you are scared of, right? The key thing to fear is that it's very individual. Now, having a background of being bullied, of being abused as a child for many years in school, social interaction was something that was very hard for me. It's a place where I didn't feel like I could really control the situation, especially a beautiful woman. So that produced a lot of fear and anxiety in me, whereas a combat situation is something that I had a lot of confidence in, right? I'd spent a lot of my life perfecting that art. So standing in that bar, a beautiful woman smiling at me creates fear. Yet if she would have pulled out a gun and started shooting, I would have lost all of that fear and gone right into action. And so this first key and very important point is the fact that fear is relative. Right? Fear isn't something that you can judge on someone else or even expect or predict. And that same thing should be directed back at you. Understanding that fear and where fear comes from is a critical aspect to being able to understand how to show courage. So, here's a picture of me jumping out of an airplane. Does that take courage for me? Now, I could easily lose my life, right? There's always a risk to my life every time I jump out of that plane, especially when we're doing some of that crazy stuff with other canopies or with a professional team. Does that take courage? Most people would say yes, but the reality is that it doesn't take any courage for me to jump out of a plane. Why is that the case? And this is a critical point. And understanding and saying, well, you've got a ton of experience, you've done this before, that isn't the key part. The reason it doesn't take courage is because I'm not scared of it. I don't have fear well up when it's time to jump out of a plane. I've conditioned that fear out of me over a whole lot of time training. And so this is an absolutely key point. And this is a real paradigm shifting point. Courage is not the absence of fear. The most important thing when it comes to showing courage is actually fear. You can't show courage if you don't have fear to begin with. So those of you out there with the most fear actually have the greatest opportunity to be courageous. Now, this is one of those points. Remember I said at the beginning that these concepts, these fundamental concepts, not only are going to be useful for you, but can be useful for those around you. I know for most of my life, I always believed that courage was represented by those that didn't show fear. Imagine the difference if you would have known as a young child that every time you felt fear, that was actually an opportunity to be able to show courage, to illustrate courage. How would that have changed your life? And that same message, being able to share that with those around us, is absolutely critical. And so that means we're going to spend a lot of time in this lesson really drilling down to the foundational well that fear comes from, being able to understand where fear comes from, where it's developed, because through that understanding, we're going to start being able to illustrate courage once we understand how to counteract fear. I love sharing this story. I'll change the name for the innocent or not so innocent. So this is a picture of my first LPO, so leading petty officer as a SEAL. So this is one of the more senior enlisted guys in my first platoon. And one of the key parts to this story is that this is the guy that I had to look up to, right? And what you'll see him doing here is throwing up into a bag. And it's not because he's airsick, it's because he's terrified of heights. Now, think about this. This is not your normal skydive. This is before we're jumping out of a plane at night with combat equipment over 16,000 feet in the sky. Right? This guy, when he would climb a ladder, you could start seeing his legs shake, right? He had an absolute huge fear of heights. Yet he's standing on this plane about to jump out of the plane in one of the most dangerous environments you could be in at height. Now, when the light turned green, what do you think he did? He was the first one out of that plane. Right? Now, when we think back to the distinction of me, right, on that same exact jump, I was shaking with excitement and couldn't wait to jump out of that plane, as opposed to shaking with fear. I didn't feel any fear. Yet this guy was so scared he was throwing up. Yet getting up and jumping out of that plane, that's showing courage, right? It doesn't take courage for someone that doesn't have fear. It takes courage to take action when you have fear. In this particular piece, right, this distinction of courage is critical. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's making the right decisions and taking the right actions in spite of fear. So once again, we go back to fear is the most important ingredient for courage. Without fear, you can't have courage. And understanding that it's action despite fear that is illustration of courage means that we can show courage in just about any environment. Anytime we have anxiety or fear is an opportunity to be courageous. And just like I said that you can't judge me for not being scared of being shot at, but being scared of beautiful women, you can't judge when someone has to show courage, right? It's just as impressive for someone that has an absolute fear of speaking to get up on a stage and speak as it is for someone that has a fear of heights to jump out of a plane. It's not relative. It's an individual experience of feeling fear and being able to take action despite that fear that illustrates courage.